Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 861, and today is December 22nd, 2025. The host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. Hope everybody is excited and happy to be preparing for the big holiday week here. I did want to get out at least one show this week to update everybody on some news. It seems there is a lot going on in the world that we need to talk about. So, share the show. It's hosted, of course, at the Libertarian Institute. I repost everything I do, whether that is this show, the Kyle Anzalone Show, all my articles that are published routinely at judgenap.com, the Libertarian Institute, somewhat less frequently at antiwar.com, on my Twitter handle at KyleAnzalone_. Let's jump into the news for today. First up here, this one, U.S. seizes third ship carrying oil near Venezuela. So, yesterday we had the second ship seized, and then Reuters had reported shortly after that a third ship was seized, all in the Caribbean. This seems to be an effort to topple the Venezuelan government as well as the Cuban government. Yes, you heard that right. I read an article in the Wall Street Journal that a big part of this project is not only aimed at Venezuela, but also Cuba. They say this is hurting the Cuban economy and it has put that government on the brink of collapse. Now, I don't actually know for sure, and just based on history, I would be very skeptical that the Cuban government really is on the brink of collapse here, but I do think it's noteworthy that this is being fed to the Wall Street Journal, and as we've been talking about on this show for some time, that the real goal of the aggressive policy in Venezuela is they believe it'll be the first domino in a series in Latin America where the U.S. is overthrowing or removing governments we don't like. They think the resources, the natural resources of Cuba or of Venezuela, is what has sustained the Cuban government. And without that, that government will collapse. Again, with the 6 decade plus long embargo the U.S. has had on Cuba, I think we should all be very skeptical of this claim that somehow a bit less oil is going to cause a meaningful change in what's going on in Cuba, but that is the claim that we're getting from sources in the U.S. government. So it looks like we're inching ever closer towards a war with Venezuela, that they're going to, now that they've hit the drug boats and that hasn't done anything to destabilize Maduro, the new plan is to go after the oil. When that doesn't work, I'm guessing we're going to start seeing land strikes inside of Venezuela at some point in the not too far distant future at this point. All right. Moving on here, this one I wrote for the Institute on December 21st. Russian envoy says talks with the U.S. constructive. So a Russian businessman who's acting as the envoy for President Vladimir Putin traveled to the U.S. I believe he met with Tulsi Gabbard. I know he's had a couple rounds of talks with Steve Witkoff as well. And Witkoff and this guy, I think Kirill Dmitriev, is probably a good combination. It seems that he and Witkoff are kind of similar players where they're both businessmen first. They're not necessarily politicians, career diplomats, or had served in governments, but now serve as envoys to their president and are working on hammering out a deal. So again, I think this is possibly positive, but there is a lot going on here. So first off, before the talks, they did say that, he's the Russians said that Dmitriev is currently on a business trip to Miami. He will bring some signals that the Americans have received from the Europeans and from the Ukrainians, and we will discuss all this here, see what can be accepted and what can be categorically and what cannot be categorically accepted. So after the first round of talks, Dmitriev told the press that the discussions are constructive. They began today and will continue tomorrow. The Kremlin has responded positively initially to the 28-point peace plan that Trump put forward. However, that peace plan has now undergone several revisions, and I don't think there's any real public reporting on what is in the final plan. We get this idea that there's going to be security guarantees for Ukraine. As I've been talking about on this show, I do think Russia has signaled that they are open to security guarantees for Ukraine. Of course, this is all dependent on the language, right? If the US says that something very vague, like if a third country invades Ukraine, the US will take some action to support the Ukrainian government, that's probably vague enough that the Russians are going to say, okay, especially if it's not in a binding treaty. It's just some executive order that Trump signed, which the next president could completely withdraw from, or should the time come that another country, whether it be Russia or Hungary or Greece or Turkey, invades Ukraine, then the president would have, essentially complete authority on whether he wants to follow that executive action or not. Um, However, they have talked about making the security guarantees look like a NATO Article 5 security guarantee, which, of course, would be outright rejected by Russia, right? This was the whole problem in the first place. We can't have a Article 5 security guarantee from NATO to Ukraine, and Ukraine can't be a member of the alliance. So it seems like if they go in that direction, we're going down a very bad path where it's going to kill the Tots. There are other directions that this could go down, of course. Now, one other thing or I guess a few other things to mention all this. There's also the territory that's an issue. There's also demilitarization of Ukraine, future elections, war reparations. Will Russians or Ukrainians face trial for war crimes after this is all said and done? And these are all issues where both Kiev and Moscow have firm positions, and the other side hasn't kind of worked out a compromise yet. And so from my reading of this, I think we're still very far away from an agreement. I know the White House has put out that they think 90% of the issues have been resolved. If that is true, it's just that the 10% of unresolved issues are all the most significant issues. And so all those other issues are far easier to work out resolutions to, where the big ones are going to be the ones that take some time. I guess, two last things to note here. Dmitriev also made a comment about the European influence, the European and the Ukrainian input into the peace agreement as being rather unconstructive. And so, this is the refusal to cede territory, the Article 5 security guarantees, using the frozen Russian funds for Ukraine. All of these things, of course, are problematic from the Russian perspective, and they're saying that those are rejected. And then Dmitriev also blamed the Western press for undermining Trump's push to end the war, kind of saying there's this well-funded, well-organized warmonger media campaign in the US, UK, and EU to undermine President Trump's peace plan. UK and EU politicians push the let's go to war with Russia, covering up migration blunders, cashing in on weapons via friendly contractors. And then the last point to all this I want to make is Europeans, I don't think they were able to hammer out an agreement to use the frozen Russian funds. They wanted to take out like $100 billion loan for Ukraine using the frozen Russian assets as collateral. Of course, as this is just aid going to Ukraine, it's not necessarily for the rebuilding of Ukraine. It seems that there's a net to 0% chance that the Ukrainians would ever pay back this loan. And so then the Russian assets would be used. And, this creates a real problem for ending the conflict. Trump's peace plan does leverage those frozen Russian assets to try to put some pressure on Moscow to end the war. If they want that back, then they're going to have to end the conflict, right? And then some of those funds would be used in Ukraine. But if those funds are already tapped into, this is obviously going to make them unavailable as the leverage. And so they're kind of setting, it maybe is a short-term help for Ukraine, but ultimately it's going to cost Ukraine more in the long run. All right, moving on to Israel news here. Israel approves large settlement expansion. So the Israeli government has approved the creation of 19 new settlements in the West Bank. The settlements built for Jews are on Palestinian lands occupied by Israel. So, according to Israel Katz, that is the finance minister, the cabinet approved the proposal that I raised with my friend, Defense Minister Israel Katz, to declare and regulate 19 new settlements. The settlements are like three different things. So, one is there are two settlements that were abandoned during the disengagement of 2005. And when we talk about the disengagement, this is mostly about Gaza, but there were some West Bank settlements that were also abandoned. Again, this, made it appear that there was the possibility of a two-state solution when Israel engaged in this disengagement policy in 2005. And so bringing these settlements back is a sign that, Israel never intends to allow the two-state solution, independent Palestinian state, to come about. And then it also officially recognizes some, even what Israel would call illegal settler outpost in the West Bank. A lot of times these settlements are occupied by the most radical and violent of Israeli settlers, and then they are going to be building some new settlements on lands that Palestinians were expelled from. So, Israel has rapidly expanded settlements in the West Bank since Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu returned to power in 2022. Smolcher said the government has approved 69 new settlements, bringing the total to 210. So think about that. Roughly one third of all Israeli settlements have been approved since 2022. And of course, this should come as no surprise to anyone. Everybody kind of likes to point to October 7th, 2023 as the date that changed everything in Israel. But really, December 2022 is the date that changed everything, because this is when you get the Israeli government that's openly talking about annexation of the West Bank, the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians from historic Palestine, and really acting. It's not just rhetoric. They're acting on this. They're implementing policies. They're expanding settlements. And, I think this is ultimately a big part of what provoked Hamas to carry out the October 7th attack. And so, we see this going on since the Israeli government has come in. And Bezalel Smotrich has been very clear about this. He even said that a part of this is burying the idea that we're ever going to have a Palestinian state. All right, so next up here, we have this one from our friend over at antiwar.com, Dave DeCamp. Israel has killed over 400 Palestinians in Gaza since Trump-backed ceasefire went into effect. Now, I just want to read you, this is obviously a fake headline, but just imagine had at the beginning of October, Russia and Ukraine entered into a ceasefire and a prisoner of war swap that was ultimately meant to lead to an end of the conflict. And since that time, the Ukrainians haven't attacked Russia, but every single day, Russia is shelling and bombing the front lines and has killed over 400 Ukrainians. First of all, every single day in the Western press, every single outlet, from Fox News to CNN to MSNBC to the New York Times to the Washington Post to the BBC to DW to France 24, every single outlet in the Western press would be running an article about how today Russia killed X number of Ukrainians and how the ceasefire is falling apart and how Trump was foolish to agree to it in the first place and how this is proof that the Russians are evil and that they don't want peace. And so if this headline said Russia has killed over 400 Ukrainians in Ukraine since Trump-backed ceasefire went into effect, again, there would be absolute massive outrage and panic over what the Russians were doing. But because it's the Israelis, the most intense headline that we ever get is Israel tests Gaza ceasefire by killing 24 Palestinians, 5 Palestinians, 10 Palestinians. Every single day, an average of 5 Palestinians are dying in Gaza during the ceasefire period. Now, everybody who has witnessed what Israel has done over the past 2 years knew this was going to happen, right? If you look at Lebanon, where there is also a ceasefire, Israel bombs Lebanon every single day. Thousands of ceasefire violations since that ceasefire took effect last year. Hundreds of civilians killed in Lebanon by Israel since that ceasefire went into effect, and they're doing the same exact thing in Gaza, right? This isn't a ceasefire. It's a slowdown in the genocide that Israel is carrying out, and it's very, very important to understand that. All right. So moving on here, this is Israel preparing intelligence dossier to convince Trump to restart war on Iran. So I found this in Israel Hayam. It was published on Saturday, and this is of course the Adelson funded outlet that is I would say like similar to an Israeli Fox News or something like that. They're pro Likud, they're pro Netanyahu, and this is coming out because the Israelis wanted to come out, and so they're putting it together an intelligence dossier, and it's going to claim that Tehran is reviving its nuclear program, rebuilding its missile stockpiles, expanding its global terrorist activity, and increasing funding for Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Ansar Allah in Yemen. And they're also going to say that Iran serves as a key weapons pipeline to Russia. And so if Donald Trump goes ahead and helps the Israelis not just bomb the Iranian nuclear program, but they're going to ask him to help to topple the Iranian regime, that's what needs to happen. And one of their arguments is going to be, if we don't do this, it's going to require a series of small wars to keep batting down the Iranians, to keep punishing the Iranians and preventing the Iranians from doing nefarious things, which of course most of it is just propaganda and lies. The Iranians aren't doing that many nefarious things in Israel, against Israel in the Middle East anyways, right? They're not building a nuclear weapon, so Israel wouldn't have to go to war with Iran every 6 months to prevent them from building a nuclear weapon. But that's what the Israelis are going to sell to Donald Trump, that, hey, we're going to have to fight war every 6 months during your presidency, and this is really going to get in the way of your claim that there's a historic piece of, that we haven't seen before in 3,000 years in the Middle East, unless we go ahead and take out the Iranian government. Now, I'm not sure how this is going to go over with Donald Trump. Netanyahu is going to bring this up. Israel Hayam points out that Ron Dermer, who was Israel's strategic affairs minister and maybe still is, but definitely was Netanyahu's closest confidant, he's no longer in the government, so he's not going to be attending this meeting. I'm not sure if that's going to kind of hurt Netanyahu's messaging or not. But also, there are some reports that the Trump administration in the past week has been a little bit upset with Israel and their ceasefire violations in Gaza. It's not that they're threatening to cut the military support. It's not that they're really looking at reviewing or revising the U.S. special relationship with Israel. Just that there are, some reports that the Trump administration is less than happy with Netanyahu at this point. And so it may not be the best time for Netanyahu to go and try to pitch Trump on starting a new war. But at the same time, this has worked for Israel in the past, so I guess no real reason to think it won't work here. All right, last story up here today. At least 5 killed by large-scale U.S. airstrikes targeting ISIS in Syria. This one from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. At least 5 people were killed by major U.S. airstrikes that were launched by in Syria on Friday against ISIS targets. According to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, they said the operation left at least 5 individuals torn in pieces, including the leader of a cell and his members who were responsible for launching drones towards the eastern Euphrates River region. The strikes were launched in response to a December 13th attack. They killed 2 members of the National Guard and an American civilian interpreter in Palmyra, central Syria. U.S. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth called the airstrikes a declaration of vengeance, but the gunman that killed the Americans was a member of the Syrian security forces, and ISIS never took responsibility for the attack. And so the U.S. is in this really uncomfortable position here, right, where we have embraced Ahmed al-Shara, who just a couple months ago, his name was Abu Mohammed al-Jolani. And al-Jolani was the leader of Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, in Syria. And HTS in Syria controlled the Idlib province. And after Assad fell, the gunman, who was a member of ISIS, left that group and went and joined the remnants of HTS, where he was then integrated into the Syrian security forces, where he then killed an American. And so really, if the U.S. government really wanted to take retaliation on the people responsible for this, they would have had to bomb the Syrian security forces that we've just welcomed their president into the United States of America, into the Oval Office, into the White House. He had a meeting with Donald Trump. We're removing him from the terrorism list and the sanctions list, even though he fought against the U.S. during the Iraq War, founded the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria, and has, led his band of thuggish jihadists all the way from a rebel group to the leadership in the government of Syria. So this is not unexpected, but we should all be very upset at the U.S. government, and not just Donald Trump and Biden and Trump and Obama, for what they've done in Syria and how much that has, look, to the extent that there are threats to Americans in the world. I think most of them originate with the jihadist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And so the idea that we would embrace a government led by a former Al-Qaeda leader who, again, this attack would maybe suggest that the former designation is really just some propaganda, should be very outrageous to the American people. All right, everybody. That's where I'm going to wrap it up for today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I am going to try to do another episode of Conflicts of Interest later this week, and certainly we'll have more, at least 2 episodes of the Kyle Anzalone show this week. Harrison Berger returns to the show today. Really looking forward to that one. Be sure to subscribe to the show so you don't miss it. Thanks, everyone.